Welcome to Nesta Sparks, and welcome to Nesta if you haven't been here before. So I'm Cath Sleeman, I'm a data scientist here, and I specialise in creating data visualisations, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. But before we start, I did want to say thanks so much for coming. I'm well aware that it's Halloween and you could all be having much more fun elsewhere, so I'm really grateful that you came, and for that reason we're going to keep things kind of motoring along. I'm going to speak for about 30-35 minutes on data visualization. I'll show you some examples of what I've made, provide some tips for getting started. And then we have Juan Mateos Garcia, who is our Head of Innovation Mapping here at Nesta. He's going to speak for 10 minutes or so on creating data visualizations to inform innovation policy. And then we'll have 10 minutes or so for questions, and then we'll be done. So perhaps just to start, I'll just say one word about Nesta. We're an independent charity, and we focus on supporting and researching innovation. There are 6 areas of work, and I concentrate on 2 of those, education and the arts. And broadly what I try to do is show how we can use novel sources of big data, and that data can range from things like job adverts to film credits. And I use those data sources to try and improve our understanding of important issues. And those issues can range from things like the threat of automation to the lack of diversity in the creative industries. So I've got quite a wide-ranging focus, but I'm always using data visualization as a kind of communication tool. So I thought I'd start just by showing you around half a dozen examples of data viz I've created over the last couple of years. I'm not going to go through them thoroughly, but I'll just point out the old feature kind of here and there. So my most recent data viz came for a project where Nesta had been funded by the ONS to investigate what job adverts could tell us about skills. We've got a data set of around 40 million job adverts for UK jobs from the past 5 years. And my colleague Jill, who's a data scientist, had used that data set and machine learning to create a skills taxonomy. We wrote this discussion paper together about the taxonomy, and it was really aimed at a kind of academic audience. But we both thought that there might be a broader audience for this work. So perhaps workers might be interested to see the salaries associated with different skills. Perhaps policymakers might like to see kind of which skills are in greatest demand. And perhaps students might like to see the kind of skills they need for different jobs. So I built a series of data visualizations to make the insights just a little bit more accessible. So this first data viz here shows the skills taxonomy itself. It's a tree diagram or dendrogram. There are 6 broad groups of skills, and they break into more specific skill groups, and then they break once again. So the tree itself is fully expanded. Often dendrograms are closed, and you have to click on each node to expand them, and that kind of becomes frustrating. The labels are also all curved so that they fit the shape of the tree. And I wanted to give people a sense of the most demanded skills in the UK. So I added in a bar chart at the end there. And I'm just showing the labels for the largest bars so that it doesn't look too busy. There's also a search box at the top. So you can type in your job title and find the branches of the taxonomy that your job draws on. And there's mouse overs or tooltips. So if you hover over any branch, you see a little box like that aqua one there. And it tells you things like the job titles that mention the skills in that group. I've created a couple of other charts too. This one looks at salaries for different skills. It was really important to show the upper and lower quartiles of the salaries for this one, not just the median, because as you can see, the salaries mentioned in job adverts are really spread out, and we didn't want to give the impression that kind of small differences were meaningful. I also marked out the skills that were in greatest demand just by only showing the kind of the labels and figures for those larger skill clusters. This is what the entire chart looks like here. I thought it was important for people to be able to make comparisons easily. So the large skill groups are ordered from highest salary to lowest salary. So we've got IT at the top there. And then within each group, the bars are ordered as well. This last chart here is just a fairly simple scatter plot. It shows salaries on the x-axis and growth in demand on the y-axis, and the size of the rectangles reflects the total demand for each skill group by employers in the UK. So the skills here in the top right-hand corner, they're the ones that are paid well and demand for them is growing quickly. So things like data engineering and IT security. The challenge in creating this chart was labelling. So I wanted to include enough labels so that people could quickly get a sense of what skills were where without having to hover over them all individually. But that meant having to make the chart very long, and so the labels don't bump into each other, and then you can't see the bottom of the chart when you're at the top, and vice versa. So I added a little border around the chart. It's called a strip plot, and it shows you the broad skill group that each skill belongs to. And it kind of gives you a bit of a summary of what's going on. Once again, there's a search box, so you can type in your job title, like data scientist, and then you can see the skills that your job needs. And then I put little pulsing circles behind each square to try and catch people's eye. So that's the latest one. I've also done a couple of projects looking at the gender imbalance in the creative industries. So this data viz shows the gender of composers whose work was played at the Proms. The Proms is now the world's largest classical music festival, and it's been going for over 100 years. They've had approximately 50,000 works played, so I inferred the gender of each composer, and then I tracked the gender balance over time. What I found was that female composers often featured more frequently at the Proms in the early 20th century than they have in recent years. So this data viz was part of a larger article, and as you can see, the visualization starts with a piece of music, a few bars, and then that transitions into a couple of different charts. The score itself is the first few bars of a piece called Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been played at the Proms every year since 1953, and thanks to Millicent Fawcett, it's also become closely associated with the women's suffrage movement. And has now become the anthem of the Women's Institute, or WI. So that's why I chose that particular piece of music. Last year I published another piece of work on gender, this time looking at the casts and crews of British films. So the British Film Institute had compiled this amazing data set containing the credits from every UK film made over the last 100 years. So there are over 250,000 unique people in this data set. And the headline result from that research was that there's been no real improvement in the on-screen gender mix since the end of World War II. And even now, in 2017, women still make up only around 30% of on-screen cast members. So I built a range of data visualizations for that project, and you can just see a few here, but I'll just point out a couple of the features. So in this chart, the white line shows the estimates for the percentage of cast members who are women over time. And the slightly fainter white bars, they show the level of uncertainty around those estimates. And then to provide some context, I also added in the gender balance in the wider UK workforce over time. That's shown there by the black line. I also experimented with using the background colour of the chart to show another variable. So in this case, it's showing the number of films released each year in the UK. And then to make the x-axis a little bit clearer, I extended some of the bars down and staggered the placement of the titles. I also experimented with the heading of the article by turning it into a data visualization itself. So currently 70% of cast members are men, so 70% of the width of the heading is blue. And then I used a kind of miniature version of that all through the article. So whenever we had a paragraph break, kind of 70% of the line is blue. I just like the idea of kind of trying to hide like data insights in plain sight. So that's film. The next couple of examples are all about antimicrobial resistance. So Nesta runs a prize fund called the Longitude Prize, and it supports innovations that combat the rise in resistance of bacteria to antibiotics. And each year, new data on resistance is released by an organisation called the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. And their report has got really fascinating data in it, but it contains over 30 different tables. They're spread out over 100 different pages, so it's quite hard to get a sense of the big picture. But once again, it's really important that the public understands antibiotic resistance, because understanding alone can help to reduce it. So for a couple of years, I've taken the data and I've tried to visualize it. So in 1 year, I tried showing lots of detail. So each circle here is for a different bacteria, like E. coli or MRSA. And then the pizza-like kind of wedges that you see, that shows resistance levels and how they vary for a particular country. The inner circle shows resistance in 2012, and then as you go out with the year, so the outside circle is for 2015. So this is just a larger view for a single bacteria. So the red and blue marks, they show countries where there have been statistically significant changes over time in resistance. I also wanted to show the uncertainty around the estimates. So in each cell, the colour at the centre of the cell corresponds to the upper bound of a confidence interval, and the colour at the edge of a cell corresponds to the lower bound from that interval. So cells that look uniform in colour, they indicate really precise estimates. And cells where the colour changes a lot, they denote more uncertain estimates. And what you can see is that in countries in southern and southeastern Europe, where resistance is high, it is also often uncertain too. So that was attempt 1. This was attempt 2 last year. I changed tack totally. I took the same data but went for something much, much simpler. This just shows resistance levels for one bacteria at a time. We're starting with E. coli. So the longer the bar, the higher the resistance level. And those purple squares, they just show how resistance levels have changed over the last few years. And hopefully the bars look something like bacteria. I'm not sure. I guess it's just to show you, though, that there's no one right approach to visualising a single data set. There's always lots of different directions that you can go in. More recently, I've been experimenting with physical data visualisation. That's simply where a physical object embodies or reflects data. This is one I co-created with Stephen Bennett this year for one of Nesta's events called Future Fest, which was held at Tobacco Dock. The piece comprised hundreds of medicine bottles that were suspended on wires. This is the whole piece here on the left. It's around 5 metres in height. There's one wire for each different region in the UK. And the blue bottles, they show life expectancy in that region. So the higher the bottle, the longer the life expectancy in that region. And the amber bottles show a measure called disability-free life expectancy. That's the number of years that you can expect to live without incurring an age-related disability in that region. And then on the floor, we designed a mat which showed kind of which wire corresponded to which region, so that someone could walk around and kind of locate their area. So the wires, or the regions, they were ordered by this measure called disability-free life expectancy, and that produced a kind of spiral effect in the amber bottles. And the piece itself, as was said, is called the 20-year gap, and that's because there's a gap of 20 years in disability-free life expectancy across the UK. And we found it was just a really effective way of engaging people in the issue and helping to raise awareness. So another example of a physical data viz is this one here that I created for a competition recently run by 360 Giving. 360 Giving is a charity that encourages funders to publish their grants data. And they've built up this incredible database called GrantNav, and anyone can view it, it's online. And the competition asked entrants to visualise their data in a really novel way. And so I created a series of paper trees to capture the variety of different grant-making models that are out there. So there's one tree for each of the 20 largest funders in the UK. And the features of the tree reflect different attributes of the funders. So the top of the tree shows the growth in funding over the last few years. The length of each branch shows how much they've given to different themes, from things like housing to sport. And then the base of the tree shows the total value and the number of grants that each organisation has awarded. And then by comparing the trees, you can spot different approaches to funding. So some funders like Department for Transport, Sport England, Ministry of Justice, they all concentrate their funding on a single theme. And so their trees each contain one branch that's longer than the others. While many other grant funders, they're more generalist, and their branches are more even in length, and they spread their funding over a variety of different themes. So those were just a few examples of what I've done recently. But why might you want to use DataVis as a way to kind of share your findings? Why does it work? I think there are two reasons, and both are kind of connected to efficiency. So data visualizations make really efficient use of kind of the huge visual capacity that we have as human beings. And they make great use of efficient use of space on the page. So we can communicate a lot of information in a fairly small amount of space. So just to explain that in a bit more detail, these features here, like line orientation, length, colour, size, they're the building blocks of any data viz. They're the features that we use to represent our data. And they all share a common property. They're all called pre-attentive. And that means that we can spot differences in these features in less than 300ths of a second. So that's why we use them in data viz, because they make spotting patterns really, really easy. But crucially, what you don't see here are words or printed numbers, and that's because text is not pre-attentive. What that means is that if we've got a table of printed numbers like this one, then it's quite difficult to quickly spot the largest and smallest numbers or any kind of patterns. But if we represent those numbers using a pre-attentive feature like colour, then suddenly it becomes much, much easier to kind of spot the highs and the lows. And then we don't really need the numbers any longer because they're not telling us anything more. And then we can pack a lot more information into the same amount of space. And so that's what I mean by data viz making efficient use of our visual system and really efficient use of space on the page. So now we know how it works. I guess the next question is, how do you make a good data viz? Which is, of course, this impossible question. And I think, while you could argue that there are a few rules, like you must represent your data accurately, there aren't nearly enough rules to guarantee you a good data viz every time. I think for me personally, a good data viz is one that's packed with lots of surprising insights, and those insights are communicated in a kind of clear and really memorable way. But that's just my take. But if it's yours too, then I think what follows is just a couple of tips for how to kind of achieve that. First, I think it's really important that you don't ever rely solely on those pre-attentive features, those abstract shapes that I showed before. It's really important that you always use text as well. And we should use that text to try and draw the viewer's attention to the insights that we've identified. So this was a data viz that I made, I think, for the last election or the one before that. And it shows which politicians follow each other on Twitter. And it was called the Westminster Twitterverse. So at the end of the animation, several bits of text pop up like that. And they just point out the interesting results, or they help to clarify kind of what you're seeing. I also often use mouse overs too, so that when someone hovers over a feature, they get a bit more detail. And then in terms of the text itself, you want to ensure as much as possible that it's horizontal, so that you don't have to tilt your head. And it's important to ensure that it's large enough to be read. Another way to use text in your data visualizations is by using a scrolling data viz, like this one here. So you have a commentary kind of running alongside the visualization, and as you scroll, it triggers different animations. So this was a visualization that I made for a report we published on the future of work. It shows which occupations are most and least likely to grow over the next 10 to 15 years. And it takes into account factors like automation, climate change, and the UK's ageing population. So scrolling data viz are really popular at the moment. And that came about because it's simply much easier to scroll on a phone than it is to click. So I think they're likely to stay around for a while still. My second tip is just to always aim for clarity over complexity. It may sound obvious, but I think sometimes it can be tempting to create something that looks really complex. But at the end of the day, we do want people to understand our data viz, so clarity is really important too. These are just some examples of charts to perhaps think twice about before using, either because they distort the data or they make the viewer kind of do all the work in interpreting it. And just to mention one, perhaps, we've got birds' nests there in the upper right-hand corner. They're network diagrams where you've got millions of lines kind of crossing over each other, but it's very difficult to kind of perceive any insights in there. And then related to this point of clarity, I just wanted to quickly mention maps. So this is probably the most popular type of map. It's called a chloropleth. It's where you kind of colour in the areas. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but I'll definitely think twice before using one. And the reason is that when we use a chloropleth, we're saying that the size of the region is really important. We're taking one of our pre-attentive features, which is area, and we're using it to represent the square feet in each region. But quite often the size of a region has nothing to do with the variable that you're wanting to show. So perhaps area could be better used to represent another variable. And more often than not, it means that London becomes invisible. So you're representing 8 million people by a kind of single dot. So the effect is made worse here because they've put little outlines around each region, and those outlines are obscuring the values for London. So one way to avoid those issues is to use something called a cartogram rather than a chloropleth. So you lose some of the geographic accuracy, but you can always use area to either reinforce the variable that you're showing, like I'm doing here, or you could use area to represent another variable entirely. This cartogram is a little bit different because I'm using numbers rather than kind of abstract shapes. The reason I'm doing that is because the number of years of life is really easy to conceive of. People have a really good sense of what 2 years of extra life means. Whereas if I was plotting something like regional GDP and the figures were in the millions, then I'd use circles or squares to show them rather than text. I guess my final tip is to make the most of interactivity. So ideally, you want to try and turn your viewers into participants. We want the viewer to really think about what they're seeing. And there are lots of ways of doing that. The easiest is probably something called personalisation. And that can be as simple as adding a search box to your data viz so that someone can look up their own area or their own job. The second approach shown here is called expectation cementing. And that's where you get the viewer to try and guess the answer before they see it. And guessing helps people to kind of realise their own expectations. So this example comes from the New York Times. They got people to try and guess the relationship between parental income and the chance of the children attending college. And only once you had had a go at drawing the relationship did they kind of show you the answer. Finally, you could try scenario modelling. That's where you get viewers to try and tackle a problem themselves. So the aim is often to show viewers just how difficult the problem is. So this first example comes from the Marshall Project, and the data viz challenges people to try and cut the prison population by 50%, which was a target that someone had proposed. And the piece kind of forces viewers to ask themselves, kind of, who would you be willing to let out? And then it shows you just how hard it is to achieve that target. The other example is from the Financial Times. They asked people to choose which parts of the BBC would you choose to keep, and then it showed viewers how those different decisions would affect the licence fee that you'd need to pay. So if you are thinking about using data viz, then I think it is important to also be aware of a couple of the limitations. Data viz is a form of communication, and like every form, it has its limits, though I don't think they're often talked about, so I thought I'd mention a few. The first and most important drawback is that data visualisations can still be used to deceive people. So in that sense, it's just the same as text or any other mode of communication. So as an example of this, this chart was published by the National Review. They've got years on the x-axis and they've got global temperature on the y-axis. It is correct, but what they're doing is they're making their y-axes absolutely huge. They're starting it at 0, they're going to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So they've made the average global temperature look flat, and it gives the impression that there's been no climate change. It is accurate, but of course they should have never started their axes at 0. And then just one more example, because this is my favourite. This is a poster for the film Legend. One reviewer gave it 2 stars, but by placing it between the heads of the 2 actors, they gave the impression that in fact they'd given it many more stars, but it was just those extra stars were kind of hidden. So data viz is no means some kind of perfect objective medium, and that's important to bear in mind when we're looking at any visualisation. A second drawback relates to the fact that we never know how a viewer will look at our data visualisation. So they might be looking at it on something as small as a phone or as large as this huge desktop shown here. We don't know what browser they'll be using or the version of that browser. We don't know the speed of their connection or how long it will take for the page to load. And all these factors mean that we have canvas uncertainty. So compared to a painter, we've got much less control over our canvas. And it means that you can spend a lot of time making your data viz responsive so that it automatically adjusts to different screen dimensions and it doesn't rely on any features that aren't supported by certain browsers. And you may end up even having to make lots of different versions of the same data visualization. And that can take up a lot of time, and it can take time away from kind of thinking about the aesthetics and making a really memorable looking data viz. I think the final limitation to consider is that it can be sometimes tricky to share your data viz with others. So if we wrote a report at Nesta, then it would be easy for a journalist to kind of draw on that report and incorporate bits of it within an article that they wrote. But we can't do that with data viz. A newspaper is very unlikely to host your entire data viz because it will differ too much from their kind of accepted style and standards. So we don't have the same number of routes to audiences that we do with more traditional forms of communication. So at Nesta we focus on using social media. We share our data viz via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and we often make little GIFs or movies or screenshots, and then we promote them on those platforms. I thought I'd just finish by giving kind of 4 quick tips on how to get started in data viz, and these are just collated from various presentations I've given over the years. The first tip is not to jump to the fun bit, I guess, of kind of designing the chart. And instead, before you design, you want to have really clearly identified all the insights in your data, and you want to know which are the most important. It's basically the same approach that you'd take if you were writing a report. It's also important to think about your audience. What insights would they find most surprising or most interesting? And then with all that prep work done, the design process itself becomes a lot easier because you're just trying to make it as simple as possible for the viewers to see the same insights that you've seen. The second tip is just try and broaden your knowledge of chart types so that you can pick one that's appropriate. And to help with that decision, the Financial Times released this really handy guide. You can download it from their GitHub account. The key takeaway from the guide is that chart types should be chosen based on the type of relationship that you want to show. So do you want to show a ranking, a distribution, or perhaps a change over time? That decision then helps you to narrow down the kind of range of potential charts to choose from. I think one great thing about data viz is that there's a real community of practitioners, and they all meet on Twitter. So by following just a few key people, you can learn a lot and see lots of great data viz at the same time. These are just 10 people who came to 10 people in groups, I should say, who came to mind. So the Financial Times, they run a blog called Chart Doctor, which is really worth reading. The New York Times is probably the best at data viz. The Pudding, they've only been around for a couple of years, the Pudding, but they specialise in scrolling data viz. Andy Kirk is a data viz trainer. He's got a fantastic website, and each month he publishes a collection of the best data viz from around the web. Lisa Ross publishes a lot of great blogs, and she's recently started an online data viz book club, which anyone can join. Shirley and Nadia are doing really, really creative work in the field. And they made a series of monthly data viz called Data Sketches. Enrico and Moritz, they produce a fantastic podcast about data viz, and they interview data viz practitioners and discuss kind of current issues in the field. And then lastly, there are a couple of awards for data viz. One is called the Kantar Information is Beautiful Awards. And on their website, they have a fantastic showcase where you can explore kind of all the past entrants and winners. And of course, these are just 10 that came to mind, but there are many, many more interesting people who are worth following. I guess my last tip would simply be to have a go. So I think the best way to learn a new tool or a new coding language is not to aim to master it, but just to think up a small project that requires the tool and then just aim to complete that. And these days you don't even have to code. So there are a whole variety now of click and point tools that you can use to make data visualizations. The most popular one is probably Tableau, but there are a couple of newer ones that are worth trying, Data Illustrator and Flourish. Both of those tools are built on top of a JavaScript library called D3, and that's what I use to create my data visualizations. So in D3, everything needs to be coded, and it's not super easy to pick up, but if you can code already, then you'll be absolutely fine. And there are lots and lots of examples that you can find online, so you can just copy the code and kind of figure out how it works from there. But of course, don't forget old-fashioned kind of pen and paper, and especially paper. I think the data viz on the right there, you may have seen as you came in. It's entirely constructed from paper, and it shows you just a couple of pieces of information about the first 100 people here who registered for tonight's event. So each piece of glittery paper represents one person, and they're ordered by when people registered for the event. The colour of the paper describes the type of organisation that they're from, and then the little bits of shiny paper in between show whether the person was interested in just one area of Nesta's work or whether they were interested in all of our work. So what you see is a kind of fairly even mix of organisational types, and we see that around half of people are interested in all areas of our work, and only a handful of attendees have more kind of specialist interests. The broader point, though, is to show you that any materials can be used to create a visualization. Not everything needs to be digital. I think aside from the need for accuracy, you are really only limited by your imagination. I definitely encourage everyone to think a little bit outside the box.